Hi there. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Andra Ghent. I'm an associate professor in the finance department at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. This is joint work with Arpita Patnaik. She is a PhD student in the economics department at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So the question we're asking in this research, which is still preliminary, this is an early draft from 2020, and we are updating it as we speak. But the question we're asking is whether the Second Chance Pell pilot program is effective at reducing recidivism. So it's a fairly straightforward question. We are extremely grateful for a grant from the Thompson Center on Public Leadership to complete this work. We would not be able to do it without it. So again, we're asking whether increasing inmates' access to higher education can reduce recidivism. So the theory on this is that increasing the opportunity cost of prison by increasing the chance of inmates getting a good job upon release may reduce recidivism. So Doliak has a model of recidivism, but on the other hand, a lot of inmates might not have the educational background to take advantage of opportunities to attend college. There are studies of inmate access to higher education, but they suffer from pretty severe selection bias in most cases. So we went through a RAND meta-analysis of 57 studies of the effect of education on recidivism. Only 7 of those studies addressed selection bias at all. And usually they only addressed it by controlling for observable characteristics. So things like inmate, the crime they were incarcerated for, their county of residence, age, race, not unobservables, right? So we think that there are differences in inmates, such as motivation or peer effects, that we just don't see in the data, so we can't control for. And that's the sort of selection bias we are especially concerned about. And so existing economic research that has controlled for this sort of selection bias they found it very difficult to link any particular policy actions to recidivism. So in Doliak's analysis, she finds that even giving an inmate a job, you just give them a job. Even that doesn't necessarily reduce recidivism. So it's a tough problem. So what we're going to do here is we're going to study the impact of the Second Chance Pell Grant pilot program on 6, 12, and 18-month recidivism rates of Wisconsin inmates. The policy was announced in summer 2015, and what it did is it restored inmates' ability to access Pell Grants. The previous access had been banned by the Gordon Amendment in 1994. What our paper is going to do to address self-selection is we're going to use something called a difference in difference approach, and I'll explain what that is in just a couple slides. But what we're going to take advantage of is that the Second Chance Pell Grant program in Wisconsin was only available to inmates housed in certain facilities. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to look and say, did the recidivism rate for the eligible inmates in these facilities change more than in facilities where that wasn't available to inmate? In robustness specifications, we're actually going to exploit heterogeneity in eligibility by educational status at the time of incarceration as well. So the fact that non-high school graduates would not have had access to it. And we're going to look at the differences in the trend recidivism rates. Why do we care? Why is this an important question? US incarcerates over 2 million people in any given day. That's about a 500% increase since the 1970s. Incarceration is extremely expensive. In Wisconsin, it's about $39,000 per prisoner a year. It's hard to reduce the incarcerated population. We talk a lot about nonviolent drug offenders, but if you let go of every single nonviolent drug offender in the US tomorrow, you cut the incarcerated population by at most 20%. Programs like Becoming a Man, they seem to have pretty temporary effects. It's very hard to generate public support for shortening sentences for violent crimes. People are more on board with shortening sentences for nonviolent drug offenders, but again, we need to really talk about reducing incarceration of people convicted of violent offenses. And there's a significant loss of GDP when you have 6 million former felons in the US that are, if they don't have good jobs, they're likely to recidivate. So that's why I think this is a socially important question. Summary of results. Here's what we're finding. In our benchmark estimates, inmates with educational ability, so at least a high school diploma, housed in prisons with access to the Second Chance Pell Grant program, they had statistically significantly lower recidivism rates than those housed in prisons without access to the program. We find the most robust effect in the 18-month recidivism rates. What we find in terms of magnitude, it's about a 4 percentage point lower recidivism rate on a base of 32%. So it's a large effect. We have another identification strategy. Again, we're trying to control for the selection here. In prisons where inmates had access to the program, inmates with educational eligibility had lower recidivism rates than inmates with too little or too much education. So if you already had a bachelor, you weren't eligible. But we only find statistically significant effects for 18-month recidivism rates. That specification excludes spillover effects. So what do I mean by spillover effects? Our estimates suggest that it didn't just affect the recidivism rates of the inmates who would have participated. It has, given the magnitude, it has to have had some positive effects on inmates that weren't able to participate. And we don't know exactly how that works, whether they, peer effects, but that alternative identification excludes those spillover effects. So in terms of savings, we think the program could have saved Wisconsin taxpayers as much as $2 million per year in reduced incarceration costs. Okay, so historically, inmates were eligible up until 1994, but then there was a push to get rid of them. So Bart Gordon, he argued, okay, so I know there's some isolated cases of inmates doing well with higher education, but just because one blind hog may occasionally find an acorn does not mean that many other blind hogs will. And he thought the same principle applies to federal grants to prisoners. One of the problems back then was tracking, right? So they weren't tracking the outcomes. And as you know, we didn't have quite such an out of control prison population back in 1994. So what it did, it really restricted inmates' ability to attend post-secondary institutions because most inmates are coming from low-income backgrounds and they really have a hard time coming up with the money for themselves. So they absolutely need the Pell Grants. There's very few inmates that are going to be able to pay for college without a Pell Grant. Okay, so the Second Chance Pell Grant pilot program was announced by President Obama in 2015. They solicited bids for pilot sites in August 2015. There were no pilot sites in North Carolina, so that's why we're working on Wisconsin. But the Milwaukee Area Technical College was chosen as the sole site in Wisconsin, and inmates could take classes starting in fall 2016. So there's two programs in Wisconsin. There's an in-person welding certificate program. It's small, enrollment was low, it's only enrolling about 15 students. You had to be in the lowest level of security, community corrections, to take advantage. Anecdotally, this program is super successful in terms of students getting employment upon completion. Usually they have jobs lined up before they're even done. The much larger program was a correspondence associates. They had about 100 students per semester, but it's expanding now. There's been iterations on the format in terms of delivery. And they plan to, as of when we wrote this draft in early 2020, their plan was to enhance the program with the use of clear tablets. So these were secure tablets, and that's going to be paid for out of inmates' Second Chance Pell Grant program funds. So the eligibility in Wisconsin, you had to not have previously had a bachelor's, graduate, or professional degree. You had to not have been incarcerated for a particular sex offense. It turns out that was not a restriction. In practice, very few inmates are incarcerated under this particular statute. You had to receive a test of basic adult education at a D- level at minimum, and you had to have had a high school diploma or equivalent, so either a high school diploma itself or high school equivalency diploma or a GED, and you could not currently be in default on a federal student loan or owe money on a federal student grant. The priority went to students that are within 2 to 5 years of mandatory release. They had to demonstrate financial need, and they had to have a positive conduct report. So what prisons participated? So you can see that there's about 10 prisons that participated. why those and not others? We have talked with the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, who've been very helpful with this research. All the staff over there have been outstanding in helping us out, but we couldn't really get a clear answer on why it was available in some facilities and not others, whether it was adequate staffing. It wasn't in the published Wisconsin Department of Corrections materials. So we think it's at least somewhat random. What we're going to do in our research is we're going to control for the prison itself. So we're just looking at the difference in time for the eligible inmates. We're not going to say, what we're not doing in this research is saying, I think inmates at Fox Lake seem to have a lower recidivism rate than inmates at Stanley Correctional. We're looking at the difference from when inmates got access to the Second Chance Pell Grant program. So the data was provided to us by the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. Each observation is an inmate release. And we have all releases of inmates from January 2010 through June 2019. To get a balanced sample, we're only going to use releases from January 2014 through June 2019. And then we're going to follow the inmates through June 2019. We had a restriction on our data use agreement that required no identifiable inmate information. That's in our upcoming iteration of this paper. We're going to have a little bit more information on the inmates, we hope, because we hope we're going to have a new data use agreement in place. So we don't have a TABE score, for example. Otherwise, we have fairly comprehensive information on inmates. And what we count as recidivism is the first date of rearrest, reconviction, or reincarceration. So our baseline difference in difference estimate, so our outcome variable takes a value of 1 if the inmate recidivates within M months of release. And M is going to be 6, 12, or 18 months. What I want you to focus on is this interaction term. So treated takes a value of 1 if the release is from an eligible facility. Notice that we are controlling for whether it's in the post period. So so if the release is on or after June 2017. So here again, we've got at least 8 months of time they could have gone to college. So they've at least been able to get 1 year of college under their belt. And we're also controlling for whether that facility was eligible. So what we're identifying the effect of the program off of is this interaction between treated and post. And then to control for what we can see, so indicators, we have this vector of demographics, so gender, age categories, race, the length of the sentence they were given, the category of offense, the custody class at the time of release, and the county of offense. And we're only going to estimate this on a set of inmates with a high school diploma or equivalent, or some college. Some college would also have been eligible. The other way we're going to try to get at this effect is looking only at inmates housed at Second Chance Pell Program facilities, where now we're only going to use data from those particular facilities, but now we're going to exploit differences in the recidivism rates among educationally eligible and non-educationally eligible releases. So we're again have our vector of controls, and then our treated now takes a value of 1 if the inmate has a high school diploma, some college, or an equivalency, this high school GED equivalency. And again, we're controlling for the fact that the treated, we're controlling for just there likely are differences in recidivism between different educational categories. And we're controlling for overall time trends in this post control. So our control group now is a set of inmates housed at the same facility that don't have a high school diploma or equivalent. So what do we find? So in our benchmark, you can see that I want you to focus on this column here. This is our 18-month recidivism rate. And you can see that we find that inmates treated by the program, so housed at these particular facilities and after the program comes into effect, they have about a 4 percentage point lower recidivism rate, depending on what demographics we control for. You can see that somewhat encouragingly, it doesn't matter too much what controls we include in our vector. We get broadly, 3 to 4 percentage points. we see the biggest effect in the 18-month recidivism rates, but we do see also effects in the 6 and 12-month recidivism rates. But the most significant effect is definitely in the 18-month, and that's where we get the most statistical significance usually. So the other thing we're going to look at is we're going to look only at post-period, counting it as releases after June 2018. This is the first date on which the inmate could have had a full 2-year degree. We're going to look, there were 1 or 2 facilities that did not have active programs that as of fall 2019, for some reason, they didn't get their programs off the ground. And then again, I'm going to talk about identification by educational eligibility instead of facility. The advantage of this is it's robust to the possibility that facility choice correlated with other factors that change recidivism throughout time. The disadvantages exclude spillover effects from the treated population on the untreated population within a facility. So we're now basically saying the fact that we had some inmates going to college, that we're excluding the possibility that that had positive effects on the behavior of inmates that had below high school education. And then we're actually going to use a triple difference specification based on both educational eligibility and facility location. And here's what we find when we do this. So changing to the post period being June 2018, we can only look at 6-month recidivism. And we do find a negative effect, but you can see that we just don't get statistical significance. And we're hoping that with a little more data, a little longer follow-up here, we might get a little more information on that. But it seems to be a similar magnitude. Similar thing for when we only look at active locations. When we do identification by educational eligibility, here we get actually a fairly similar effect in the 18-month recidivism rates, but no statistically significant effect in 6 and 12 months. And then when we do the triple difference, when we both exploit differences in educational eligibility and which facilities offered it, we get a negative effect on all 3 recidivism rates, very small in the 6-month, but it's not statistically significant. And we can't tell you, is there no effect, or is it because we just don't have enough data? So that's why we want to kind of follow up later on with this. Cost savings. So how do we figure out the cost savings? So here, looking at the 18-month column, we had 2,900 releases of inmates that were educationally eligible. Here's the share from treated facilities. So 48% of those inmates were housed in treated facilities. So 1,400 would have been eligible. That's not the ones that actually participated. Our point estimate for the reduction in recidivism rates is about 4.2%. And so when we think about the number of prison re-entries that went down, we get about 59 of them were prevented by the program. And if you, the number that the Wisconsin Department of Corrections cites for the cost is about $38,644. That's the cost of housing one inmate for 1 year. So if you multiply this 59 by 38,644, you get a number of about $2 million. So overall, we don't know the overall cost of the program. So cost benefit's hard here, but potentially this has large savings. So just to wrap up, what we find is that the Second Chance Pell Grant program reduced recidivism rate by an economically significant amount. So 4 percentage points of recidivism can translate into 10 to 15%, depending on the horizon and the benchmark specification. The point estimates are always negative, but statistical significance depends on the identification strategy. Using that point estimate and assuming that it is a robust finding, you'd see that it saves Wisconsin taxpayers about $2 million per year. Our next thing on our to-do list is to get another year of data from the Wisconsin Department of Corrections so that we feel more confident in the results and I can report back. Thank you.